Good morning. Today I want to talk about grains and legumes in dog food because they're quite common to be typical ingredients like potato, rice, sometimes corn, brown rice, brewer's rice. Anyways, there's a whole, as well as these legumes because the legumes tend to be in the grain-free diets, but they still have, a fair bit of starch and carbs in them as well. But anyways, most commonly these are like high volumes of these starches in dried dog food is because it's just essentially a binder. It's really good at binding the proteins and the nutrients and everything together, whereas if you didn't have as much high carbohydrate content when it comes to cooking something like that, it's not going to bind properly. Think of like, when people add breadcrumbs to hamburgers to help them stay together, or meatballs for that matter, right? You need that starch kind of piece to kind of keep it all running in sequence and holding. So needless to say, that's why you also don't really see if, you ever have, trialed raw dog food, that there's really virtually none, most commonly grains or legumes in them, because it's just not they don't need it to bind it, so they don't include it because it's not necessary to hold it together. So in any event, the reason why this is important or curious to me is because there's something called mycotoxins. And this is essentially an enzyme that fungi produces that is, toxic to dogs. Now, how this all comes together essentially is that most, dog foods have carbohydrates from legumes and or starches in them. And what these fungi target is like dried starches, so like rice and etc. For whatever reason, it's just something that they colonize and they like to eat. And what happens is they create these enzymes that are not beneficial to humans and or dogs. But what happens is that our, like, as far as like legally wise, for us, we're not allowed to eat as much as a dog might. Okay, so for it to be human grade, like for one in particular of these mycotoxins, I think it's afloxetin or something along those lines. Don't quote me. This is not my field of expertise, but I have some understanding. Is that like the whole entire food can have up to 1 part per million of that mycotoxin, whereas pet food or livestock food can have 5 parts per million, and it's still within the allowable range for them to eat. So like if you think about it from a perspective of, okay, well, if we're only allowed to have 1 part per million in our entire meal, and our meals tend to be, about 30% carbohydrates, whereas a dog and its dog food can be anywhere between 30 to 60% carbohydrates, then it's like, well, the dog's allowable range is a lot higher, so they're going to get hit with a lot more of those mycotoxins, hypothetically. Now, typically, if you think of it from a standpoint of, selling food, naturally, an entity, an organization, a business is going to try to sell the food for the highest dollar amount, right? So in theory, it makes a fair bit of sense that there's a possibility that if they couldn't sell it for human grade, that it doesn't meet those standards and has some higher levels of toxicity in it. So then they sell it to the pet food industry and or livestock industry, whatever, feed, because their parameters are more open, right? Because it's unless the pet food says human grade ingredients on it, then it's not, right? Presumably it's feed quality of ingredients, which means at times, not always, but sometimes there's potential for them to have higher toxicity within it. So the reason why this is relative, because in my own journey and experience with one of my dogs, Fergus, he was exhibiting some unusual symptoms that I couldn't really quantify to anything in particular. And doing some further research, okay, so I'll give you examples like vomiting, throwing up unnecessarily, like for no reason, just a whole meal. And then the other one was, like turning his nose up to food. So while I'm doing this research, and this is like months ago, I start realizing like, okay, so some of these acute toxicity markers are when it's not, or not acute, the lower level continual exposures. Some of the symptoms are, I'll just get into it here for a second, is like mild gastro discomfort, diarrhea, vomiting, as well as like raising their nose up and not wanting to eat the food. So they're like more vague symptoms that don't seem to come from anywhere in particular and happen over time because it's an accumulation of these mycotoxins within their system that they're not necessarily ridding of because I'm feeding the same food every day, right? So it just can kind of build up and the body might not be able to rid itself of them fast enough because it continues to get kind of addressed. And the other piece of it, which is really interesting to me, was that the brand of food, and I won't say it, but this brand of food had recalls specifically for this mycotoxin I'm talking about in the past, and that's what I was feeding him for like 5 years. So it's not too far of like a leap to consider that perhaps he was getting some mild symptoms of that toxicity of the enzyme from the fungi, the mycotoxins, that were starting to build up and attributing to his change in behavior and his ability to like not want to eat, random vomiting of fully, normal meals. He even went to the vet one time for like 3 days at what looked like a blockage, but wasn't. Like there was no blockage. He had to go to, like, it was unexplained. No idea what happened. So I'm not saying that was the thing. I have no idea. I can't prove it. But in the last 6 months since I've changed him over to like a raw diet with no grains in it, all those symptoms have gone away. Like he hasn't vomited at all. He didn't turn his nose up to any food. He's always pumped up for a meal and he's just more engaged in it. So it got me like wondering like, hey, is this more common than we believe? Because there is an estimation that 25% of grains sold throughout the entire world are contaminated with mycotoxins. So it's like, pretty statistically possible that the grains that are utilized in dog food maybe have higher levels of mycotoxins than what is allowable for people. And since they're getting, potentially a similar amount per day or 2 times the amount as far as like, because some dog foods are like anywhere from 30 to 60% carbs, and we're eating approximately 30%, that it can stack up pretty quickly because their bodies are a lot smaller than ours, right? So anyways, I thought maybe some of you might find this a little bit interesting. I really did, especially since my dog had symptoms that fell in alignment with potential toxicity from these mycotoxins. And then when I removed the brand of food that I had realized had been recalled a few years prior, and changed his diet to a raw one, that all the symptoms had gone away. So I mean, I can't verify any of this. Anecdotally, it makes sense. So anyways, I thought that my experience might, be of interest and curiosity to you, and why there's tends to be a lot of carbohydrates within dried dog food, and it's a really good binder to keep it all together. And it's the cost of it is lesser than meat, obviously, right? That's like it is for us too. In any event, I'll be continuing to drip some information about this type of stuff just for anyone who's interested. I'll also tomorrow be doing like a type up of some additional information for consideration when it comes to dog food, just because I'm interested in it, and I think and lots of people might be too. Anyways, have a nice day. Until next time.